last week while we were in here, 2 people were over there at the Thompson house working over there outside. And 2 or 3 people remarked to me after church last Sunday, said, "You need to preach about working on Sunday." And they probably said that as a joke, but I got thinking about it, and I thought, well, that would be interesting to think about. Now, when we think about working on Sunday, what we're really thinking about is what's called the Sabbath. Now, the Sabbath in this context is a concept that comes from the 10 Commandments. The commandment about the Sabbath reads like this: "Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the 7th day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall do no work, you nor your son, nor your daughter, nor your male servant, nor your female servant, nor your cattle, nor any stranger within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested the 7th day. Therefore the Lord blessed the 7th day and hallowed it." Now you'll notice this prohibits all work by everybody. In this one, we heard about cattle. The 10 Commandments are listed twice in the Old Testament, once in Exodus and once in Deuteronomy. I just read the one from Exodus. The one from Deuteronomy includes farm animals. So it includes not only cattle, but all of your animals. So even farm animals are to be excluded from work on the Sabbath. And notice, it also includes your servants. So it is a day of rest for everything. And notice that that's all it says about the Sabbath. It says nothing about it being a day to do religious things. It does say, remember the Sabbath to keep it holy. But holy in this context does not mean religious. The word holy in the Bible means something that is separate or different. And so the Sabbath is holy in that it is separate and different from the rest of the days. It is the day of rest, when no work is to be done. And that's what the word Sabbath literally means. It means rest. Now, I always got a kick out of some of these businesses that post the 10 Commandments. Now, I have nothing against posting the 10 Commandments, but I've noticed that like all these businesses that post the 10 Commandments that are open on Sunday, they put, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. They conveniently leave out 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. And so I sort of get a kick out of that. And probably they don't even realize it goes on to say that, but it does. So the Sabbath is the 7th day of the week. There has been some disagreement about which day actually is the 7th day. And traditionally, Jews have seen Saturday as the 7th day of the week. And so Jews who keep the Sabbath usually keep it on Saturday. In our time, though, we tend to see Sunday as the 7th day of the week, and we tend to see Monday as the 1st day of the week. All of our, we've got calendars, I've seen them both ways. Some of them start with Sunday, and some of them start with Monday. But we just usually think of Monday as the 1st day of the week. I guess that's because it's the 1st day of the work week for most people. Now, not many Christians keep the Sabbath either on Saturday or Sunday. Years ago, that was different. I can remember years ago when most stores were closed on Sunday. Hardly anybody worked, except police officers and nurses. Hardly any stores were open. People would not mow grass or wash cars on Sunday. That was seen as a disgrace back then. Today, things are different. People do whatever they want to do. Stores are open. People mow grass and wash cars. The guy that used to live 2 doors down here where the Stevens live now, the guy that lived in that house beforehand would mow his grass every Sunday at 11 o'clock. And I think he did it on purpose because, he knew church was going on with him, but he did it. So as our Old Testament reading, we heard the part of the creation account. And we heard how God created everything in 6 days and rested on the seventh. And it says God sanctified the seventh day. Just like the term holy, that does not necessarily have a religious connotation to it. To sanctify something means the same things it does to make it holy. It means it's different. It means it's set apart for something. And so to sanctify the seventh day just means it's set apart for rest. So the origin of the Sabbath comes from the creation account and the Ten Commandments. The seventh day of the week is to be a day of rest, even for slaves and even for farm animals. It is taken seriously in parts of the Old Testament. In the Old Testament, Hebrew society, violating the Sabbath was punishable by stoning, and that was the most severe punishment they had back then. In Numbers chapter 15 is the account of a man being stoned to death on the Sabbath because he was gathering firewood. Now today, some Jews still keep the Sabbath, and they observe it from sundown on Friday until 3 stars appear in the sky on Saturday evening. It's a day of rest, and many Jews who strictly observe the Sabbath avoid even talking or thinking about business or personal affairs, anything like that on the Sabbath. And they get that from Isaiah chapter 58. God says, if you turn away your foot from the Sabbath, from doing your pleasure on my holy day, if you call the Sabbath a delight, the holy day of the Lord, and you honor him not doing your own ways nor finding your own words, then you shall delight yourself in the Lord, and I will cause you to ride on the high hills of the earth. And so that's, some Jews take that and say you don't do anything for pleasure on the Sabbath. You don't do anything that recreation-wise, anything business-wise, anything like that. It's simply a day of rest. Interestingly enough, the Old Testament indicates that the Sabbath is not just for Jews. It's for non-Jews also. Isaiah 52 says, everyone who keeps from defiling the Sabbath and holds fast my covenant, even them will I bring to my holy mountain, make them joyful in my house of prayer. Their burnt offerings and their sacrifices will be accepted on my altar. My house shall be called a house of prayer for all people. So the Sabbath, from an Old Testament perspective, is for everyone. And it is seen in several places in the Old Testament as the most important thing you can do to revere God. Now, as we move into the New Testament, things change. There are several instances in the New Testament of Jesus consciously doing things that were prohibited on the Sabbath. We heard one is our gospel reading. The disciples were out picking grain on the Sabbath. Jesus healed several times on the Sabbath, and sometimes he healed knowing that the Jews were there watching to see if he would, and he did it. Mark chapter 2 contains the oft-quoted saying of Jesus, the Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. And of course we heard Jesus say in our gospel reading that he is the Lord of the Sabbath. Now, considering how seriously the Old Testament takes the Sabbath, you would think the New Testament would do it the same way, but it seems that Jesus relaxed the requirements for keeping the Sabbath. And in fact, in the ancient Christianity, Christians did not keep the Sabbath. One reason was this, because Jesus seemed to relax the strict rules for the Sabbath, but there was something else that was even more important. You see, not long after the time of Jesus, Christianity separated from Judaism and became a separate religion. We've talked about that before, how we can see that in the book of Acts. If you start reading through the book of Acts, you'll notice that it's first about Peter and the disciples, especially Peter. Then Paul comes on the scene. Then it's about Paul and Peter. And then about halfway through, Peter drops out. And everything's about Paul from then on. And so, simply because the Sabbath was so connected with Judaism, Christians didn't keep it, mainly to emphasize that the religion of Christianity was different than Judaism. It was a way for them to say, we're not Jews, we're Christians. And it was decided that keeping the Sabbath was a Jewish law. And we see in the New Testament in a number of different places where Christians are specifically told not to keep Jewish law. In fact, the Apostle Paul says that if you keep Jewish law, Jesus does you no good. So the ancient Christians did not want to be accused of keeping Jewish law. Instead of keeping the Sabbath, from earliest times in the book of Acts, we see Christians gathered together on the first day of the week, not to keep the Sabbath, but to commemorate Jesus' resurrection. Remember, Jesus rose from the dead on a Sunday. And because of that, Sunday became the most important day of the week for Christians. We've talked about this in here before, how for the early Christians, it wasn't the crucifixion of Jesus that they concentrated on. It was the resurrection. And so they gathered on Sunday, the day of the resurrection. And eventually, Sunday became known as the Lord's Day in Christianity. That became the term applied to Sunday, the Lord's Day. And the Lord's Day replaced the Sabbath. In about the year 360, a gathering of Christian leaders called the Council of Laodicea issued a statement urging Christians not to keep Saturday as any kind of Sabbath. They urged Christians to work on that day. If you want a day of rest, take it on Sunday. Don't take it on Saturday, because if you do, it's going to look like you're trying to keep Jewish law. And so from earliest times, Christians did not observe the Sabbath. They observed the Lord's Day, a time on the seventh day, where they commemorated the resurrection of Jesus. And early Christians never really adopted taking a day of rest. Instead, they set aside to celebrate Jesus' resurrection on the first day. And that's basically how things were in Christianity up until the 1500s. And a man named John Calvin appeared on the scene. We've seen before how John Calvin would become the most influential person in Protestant Christianity, much more influential than Martin Luther ever was. Now, Calvin developed a theological tradition known as Calvinism, and Calvinism took control in England. Calvinists took control of the British government, and they took control of the Church of England. And they passed a law stating that the Church of England was the only church you could have in England. In the year 1643, the English Parliament authorized a group of church leaders to get together and develop a doctrinal statement that would become known as the Westminster Standard. It was the Calvinist guide to Christian belief. And so that was in 1643. Now, of course, the United States was settled mostly at the first by people from England, and many of the ones that came here were Calvinists. The Puritans were Calvinists. Calvinists were in control of the Church of England, and that meant that the Episcopal Church in this country would become Calvinist. The Methodists broke away from the Episcopal Church, and so they were influenced by Calvinism also. The Presbyterians were Calvinists, and back then, until the turn of the 20th century, Baptists were also Calvinists. And so you can see that Calvinism had an enormous influence on Christianity in the United States. And Calvinists believed that God sat up there in heaven, watched every move you made, just hoping to catch you in something so he could punish you. And they believed that God took delight in punishing people. And they believed then that God was a very stern, demanding God. And that's how they were themselves, because they were trying to emulate God. When they drew up the Westminster Standards, it included strict rules about the Sabbath. The Westminster Standards call Sunday the Christian Sabbath, and it says, "This Sabbath is kept holy unto the Lord when men, after a due preparing of their hearts and ordering of their common affairs beforehand, do not only observe a holy rest all the day from all their works, words, and thoughts about worldly employment and recreation, but they also take up the whole time in the public and private exercise of worship and in the duties of necessity and mercy." So see, you can see that this is strict. You can't work. You can't even think about working. You can't play ball and watch TV. You can't read a book unless it's a religious book. This had enormous influence on Christianity in the United States, and that still held over to her son in our generation. Not many, but for some. But for our parents' and grandparents' generation, it certainly did hold over. My grandmother used to have a saying, if you sewed on Sunday, when you died, you'd have to take every stitch out with your nose. And so, one time I was going to do something in the shop one Sunday afternoon a long time ago. And I went up to the shop to do whatever I was going to do. And it wasn't long till Wanda come up there and she said, "Mama said if you use power tools on Sunday, you'll cut your hand." So I waited until the next day. So that generation has passed. People of our generation do as they please on Sunday, don't think anything about it. But basically, when you look back at Christian history, Christians have never really observed the Sabbath, except for a brief period of time under the influence of Calvinism. My opinion is we've thrown the baby out with the bathwater. If we go back to how God originally intended the Sabbath, it was intended to be a day of rest. That's all it was. Very simple. Intended to be a day of rest. And that's practical. People need rest. We don't need to go without rest. The way we're made is that we need rest. And God did that for us by creating a day for us to rest. And that's why Jesus said man was not created for the Sabbath, but the Sabbath was created for man. It's because God made the Sabbath because he knows we need rest. And I think that's what Jesus was reacting to when it seemed like he was negating the Sabbath. He was reacting to the man-made rules that people had made up to go along with the Sabbath. The Sabbath had become a myriad of rules and regulations. And I think what Jesus was saying was simply, forget all those rules and regulations. The Sabbath is very simple. It's a day of rest. You find the same thing in the writings of Paul. There's an interesting passage in the book of Colossians. Paul is talking about religious rituals and regulations. And he tells Christians, don't get entangled up in the following all these Jewish customs and regulations. And one of the things he lists there specifically is the Sabbath. Don't get caught up in all these rules and regulations. Now, a few years ago, we talked about how the Old Testament contains a number of cycles of 7. If you think about the week as a cycle of 7. And of course, the Sabbath is the 7th day of the week. And there are a number of different cycles of 7 in the Old Testament. One of them has to do with farming. You were supposed to farm your land for 6 years and then let it lie fallow for 1 year. So that's a cycle of 7, farm, fallow. You're supposed to do that. There was a cycle of 7 times 7 years, where after 49 years, all slaves are freed, all debts are forgiven. The entire year was dedicated to rest. There was to be no work on the 50th year. That was called the Jubilee year. And there are other cycles of 7 in the Old Testament also. And as we see, the Sabbath is a part of these cycles of 7. If you look at the cycles of 7 in the Old Testament, you will see that every one of them, in some way, is related to rest. Every one of them is related to rest. Now, I will admit that one, and I do not keep the Sabbath. I do not mow grass on Sundays. I do not work in the yard on Sundays. I do not wash a car on Sunday or do anything like that. But we do other things. And I guess our lives are probably like yours. We're busy. We have a lot to do. Most of us would probably think it's impossible to set aside a whole day for rest. I don't believe God intended the Sabbath to be a law to follow, a rule to follow. I believe that God made the Sabbath because He realized we need rest. The pace of life today is hectic, and I think we would all benefit from taking a day of rest. You think you would benefit from that? To take a day of rest? Now, a long time ago, we looked at the idea of why some things, some behaviors are considered sins. And this has some really good application to today, the society we live in today. It goes far beyond just the Sabbath. And we decided that you could look at why some behaviors are considered sins. It's just simply because God doesn't like it. God likes Coke instead of Pepsi, in other words. So this behavior is a sin because God just prefers, just doesn't like that. And that makes it awful arbitrary, and it makes it hard for us to understand why we need to follow God's laws. If it's just that God just likes Coke instead of Pepsi, and you like Pepsi, well, But we considered another possibility. And we considered the possibility that God in His infinite wisdom sees a lot farther down the road than we do. You know, a lot of times when we do something, or if we want to do something, we can't see the very long-term effects of that, how that's going to work out way down the road. It may seem to us like, well, I'm going to do this, I don't see anything wrong with it. We might not see that way down the road it's going to have long-term bad effects. But of course, God can see long-term down the road. And God knows, well, if He does this, then nothing bad may happen this week or next week. But 10 years down the road, something bad is going to happen because He did this. This is going to lead to long-term bad effect. And if you take that view, then you can say that's the reason God tells us not to do certain things and to do other things. Because God not only knows what's good for us long-term down the road, God also knows what's bad for us long-term down the road. So He guides us by telling us not to do the things that He knows will turn out bad way down the road, and to do the things that He knows will turn out good way down the road. Now, there's lots of different areas of life today in society that you can apply. The people have decided there are no rules but the ones they themselves decide should be rules. So with the Sabbath, maybe God realizes much more than we do that we need rest, that we need a release from the grind of daily activity. And maybe God knows that we'd all be better off if we took a day of rest every week and just rest. I think all of us would have to admit it would be nice to do that. It really would be nice to be able to